Have you ever built a life so full, so loud, so relentlessly moving forward, that you quietly used it as a reason to stay just far enough away from the one person who could actually reach you? I have. I've stood in rooms that held the future of industries. I've stared at problems that would take decades to solve, and felt completely at home inside the complexity. But closeness? Real closeness. The kind where someone sees the part of you that has nothing to do with what you've built. That terrified me in a way no engineering failure ever could. Distance is seductive when you're driven. It feels like focus. It feels like discipline. It even feels, sometimes, like love, because you tell yourself you're protecting them from the cost of being near you. You tell yourself the mission requires it. You tell yourself there will be time, later, when things slow down. But things don't slow down. And later has a way of becoming never. I finally decided to close the distance. And tonight, I want to tell you why it took so long, and what I found on the other side of that decision. Stay with me, because what I'm about to say might change how you love. Imagine standing in a room with someone who loves you. They are 3 feet away. You can hear them breathe, you can see the way they're trying, quietly, without making it obvious, to close the space between you. And something in you recognizes the gesture. Something in you even wants to meet it. But another part of you, the older, more practiced part, holds its position, stays exactly where it is, 3 feet, the same 3 feet it's always been. And the strangest, most uncomfortable truth about that moment isn't that you don't care. It's that you care so much it frightens you, and so you stay still, and you call it strength. That's where I want to start. Not with grand declarations or cinematic turning points. I want to start right there, in that ordinary, devastating stillness. Because I think you know that room. I think you've stood in it more times than you've admitted to yourself. And I think, if you're honest, you've told yourself the same thing I used to tell myself. That keeping the distance was the responsible choice, the mature choice. The choice of someone who understands that getting too close costs something you can't afford to lose. But here's what nobody told me about distance. Doesn't stay where you put it. You build it carefully, like a system, like a structure, like something you designed with intention and full awareness of what you were doing. You tell yourself it's just a little space, just enough room to think, just enough room to breathe and operate and keep moving forward without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing against your momentum. And for a while, it works. It works so well that you stop noticing it's there. You stop noticing that the gap has widened, that what started as a few careful feet has become a silence that fills entire rooms, that the person who used to try to close the space has quietly, heartbreakingly stopped trying. I've watched that happen. I've been the reason it happened. And there is nothing like the specific, hollow guilt of realizing that someone loved you enough to keep reaching, and you let them get tired. Have you ever felt that? The moment you noticed the reaching had stopped, and instead of relief, all you felt was a loss you didn't know how to name? I didn't build distance because I didn't love. I want to be clear about that. I built it because somewhere in the earliest architecture of who I am, I learned that closeness was a variable that introduced risk. That the more someone mattered, the more their proximity could destabilize something I'd spent enormous energy constructing. My focus, my capacity, my sense of forward motion. I learned without anyone explicitly teaching me that emotional exposure was a form of vulnerability I couldn't engineer my way out of. So I did what I always do with problems I can't solve immediately. I kept moving. I kept the distance manageable. I treated love like a system I could optimize later, once the more urgent variables were resolved. That's the architecture of distance in people like me. And maybe in people like you. It doesn't come from coldness. It comes from a very specific kind of intelligence that learned early to protect itself. You're not distant because you don't feel. You're distant because you feel so much, and the feeling is so large and so ungoverned that you built a structure around it. A beautiful, functional, quietly devastating structure. And from the inside, it looks like composure. It looks like discipline. It looks like someone who has their life together. But here's the uncomfortable truth, and I need you to stay with me here. From the outside, it looks like unavailability. It looks like someone who is always almost there. Someone who gives generously, in every direction except the one that would require them to actually be seen. Someone who can move mountains, and build futures, and solve problems, that confuse entire rooms of brilliant people, but cannot, or will not, simply sit down and say, I am afraid of how much I need you. That sentence, those 11 words, they cost me more than almost anything I've ever said. Because need, to someone who has built their identity around capability, feels like confession. It feels like the one admission that could unmake everything. You think, if I say this, if I let this be true out loud, then what? What happens to the version of me that doesn't need anything? What happens to the engine? What happens to the mission? And so instead of saying it, you build another layer, another system, another reason to keep the gap exactly where it is. 3 feet. Always 3 feet. But I want you to think about something. I want you to really sit with this. Think about a spacecraft. Think about the mathematics of it. The extraordinary, precise, almost violent energy required to launch, to escape gravity, to achieve the velocity that carries you away from everything that would hold you down. That launch is extraordinary. And for people like us, we know that feeling. We live in the launch. We are built for the launch. The acceleration, the trajectory, the relentless forward motion. It's where we feel most alive, most ourselves, most in control. But a spacecraft that only knows how to accelerate never arrives anywhere. The mission, the real mission, requires deceleration. It requires the terrifying, counterintuitive act of firing the engines in reverse, of slowing down, of allowing yourself to be caught by the gravity of something you've been orbiting for years. And everything in the architecture of distance fights against that deceleration. Every learned habit, every protective instinct, every version of yourself that survived by keeping its velocity, all of it resists the slowdown. Because slowing down feels like falling. It feels like losing altitude. It feels like giving up the one thing you've always been able to count on, your own speed. It asks for patience. It asks for presence. It asks for the kind of courage that has nothing to do with boldness and everything to do with stillness. And I was terrible at stillness. Look at me for a second. I know there's someone, maybe one specific person, who has been in your orbit for longer than you've let yourself fully acknowledge. Someone who has matched your pace, who has understood, without needing it explained, what you're building and why it matters. Someone who has waited, not passively, but actively, consciously, with the kind of love that knows you're worth the waiting, for you to slow down long enough to let them in. I know you've noticed them. I know, because you're here, that part of you is already asking the question you haven't been ready to ask yourself out loud. What if the distance was never protecting anything real? What if the architecture you spent years constructing was keeping out the one thing that would have made everything else, the mission, the momentum, the meaning, actually worth something? I'm not asking you to answer that right now. I'm just asking you to hold it, to let it sit next to you in the room, 3 feet away, the way they have been sitting next to you all this time. Because that question is the beginning of everything. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from moving in the wrong direction for too long, and being too fast, too focused, too committed to your own velocity to notice. You wake up one day inside a life that looks, from every measurable angle, like success. The work is real. The progress is real. The momentum is undeniable. And yet there is something quiet, persistent, impossible to optimize away, that feels like standing still. Not physically, not professionally, but somewhere deeper, in the place where a person goes when the noise finally stops and there is nothing left to distract them from the truth of where they actually are. I know that exhaustion. I've lived inside it. And what I've come to understand, slowly, uncomfortably, with the kind of resistance I usually reserve for problems I genuinely cannot solve, is that busyness is one of the most sophisticated emotional defense mechanisms a driven person can build. Not because you're lying to yourself exactly, but because you're choosing every single day to stay in motion rather than stay present. And motion, when you're good at it, is nearly indistinguishable from purpose. But here's what nobody told me. Ambition and avoidance can wear the exact same face. I want you to think about the last time you canceled something personal for something professional. Not because the professional thing was more important in any objective sense, but because it was more controllable, more solvable, more likely to give you the feeling of forward motion that your nervous system had learned to require. You chose the meeting over the conversation, the deadline over the dinner, the problem you could solve over the person who needed you to simply show up without an agenda. And you told yourself it was discipline. You told yourself it was the cost of building something that matters. You told yourself they understood. They always understood. But I want to ask you something honestly. Did they understand? Or did they just stop asking? Because there is a difference. A significant, heartbreaking difference between someone who genuinely understands the demands of your life and someone who has simply learned not to compete with them. One of those people is your partner in the truest sense. The other is someone who has quietly, gracefully, at enormous personal cost, accepted second place in a race they never agreed to enter. I've been the reason someone accepted second place, and I carried that without fully acknowledging it, because acknowledging it would have required me to stop, to actually stop, not slow down, stop. And everything in me, every learned pattern, every identity layer, built on the foundation of relentless forward motion, resisted that completely. This is the psychology of running in place. You are genuinely moving. The output is real. The results are measurable. But emotionally, relationally, in the dimension that will define whether your life meant something to another human being, you are covering the same ground you were covering 5 years ago. The same distance. The same 3 feet. Different cities, different projects, different levels of external validation, but the same internal position. Just far enough away to feel safe. Just close enough to call it love. And here's the uncomfortable truth I had to swallow whole. Avoidant attachment, the pattern I'm describing, doesn't feel like avoidance from the inside. From the inside, it feels like self-sufficiency. It feels like not being needy. It feels like being the strong one. The one who doesn't require constant reassurance. The one who can compartmentalize, who can focus, who doesn't let emotions disrupt the work. These are things you've probably been quietly proud of. Things other people may have even admired in you. But what they're actually describing, what that pride is actually resting on, is a nervous system that learned at some foundational level that needing people was dangerous, that depending on someone introduced a variable you couldn't control, and that the safest strategy was to remain always, slightly, deliberately, just out of full reach. I'm not saying this to diagnose you. I'm saying this because I needed someone to say it to me directly, without softening it into something easier to dismiss. You are not self-sufficient, you are self-protective. And those two things are not the same. Look at me for a second. Think about the spacecraft again. Think about what it actually means to be the most powerful thing in the room and still be in orbit. Orbiting is not arriving. Orbiting is impressive. Orbiting requires extraordinary energy, extraordinary precision, extraordinary maintenance. You can orbit something or someone for years and call it dedication, call it loyalty, call it love even. But you are still circling, still maintaining the exact distance that keeps you from having to land, from having to commit to the gravity of someone else's world fully and without the option of retreat. Have you ever asked yourself why landing felt more threatening than the launch? Because I think you know the answer, and I think it has nothing to do with the other person. It has to do with what landing requires of you specifically. It requires you to stop performing competence, to stop being the one who has it together, to stop filling every silence with productivity and every moment of vulnerability with a pivot back to vision and purpose. It requires you to be simply a person, incomplete, uncertain, genuinely in need of something you cannot build, cannot earn, and cannot solve your way into. It requires you to receive. And receiving, for someone whose entire identity is built on giving, on output, on the forward direction of energy, receiving feels like surrender. It feels like losing the thread of yourself. But here's the reframe that changed something in me. Receiving is not weakness. Receiving is the completion of a circuit. You cannot sustain genuine connection if the energy only moves in one direction. Love is not a presentation you give. It's not a resource you manage or a system you maintain from a safe distance. It is a circuit, and a circuit with only one active end isn't a connection. It's a performance, and no matter how brilliant the performance, the person watching it eventually realizes they are an audience, not a partner. The moment I understood that, something shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the quiet, accumulated weight of all the moments I had chosen motion, over presence. I began to see them differently, not as evidence of my commitment to something important, but as a pattern, a practiced, deeply grooved pattern of using forward motion to avoid the one direction that terrified me most. Toward, not upward, not outward, not faster or further or higher. Toward her, toward the specific, irreplaceable gravity of one person who had been steady enough, patient enough, real enough to stay in my orbit while I figured out that orbiting wasn't the same as being home. It asked for honesty. It asked for stillness. It asks for the willingness to look at your own patterns without immediately reframing them as assets. And it asks for something most high-achieving people have never been taught to practice. It asks you to stop running, even when running is the only thing you've ever known how to do beautifully. Nobody tells you about the decision that happens before the decision. The visible decision, the one you can point to, describe, even be proud of. That one has a date, a moment, a clear before and after. But the real decision, the one that makes the visible one possible, happens in silence. It happens in a moment so ordinary that you almost miss it. You're not standing at a crossroads. You're not in the middle of a dramatic reckoning. You're just somewhere quiet. Maybe it's late. Maybe the work is done for the night. Maybe the room is still, and the noise has finally stopped, and there is nothing between you and the truth of where you are. And in that silence, something in you looks at the distance you've maintained, really looks at it, without the justification, without the reframe, without the next goal waiting to pull your attention forward, and says, quietly, with no ceremony at all, this is costing more than it's worth. That moment, that is the decision before the decision. And it is the most important one you will ever make. I want to talk about what it actually requires. Not in theory, not in the abstract language of self-help that sounds profound until you have to live it. I want to talk about the specific internal architecture that has to shift before you can genuinely choose vulnerability over control. Because I think we underestimate it. I think we talk about vulnerability as though it's simply a matter of will, as though you just decide one day to be more open, more available, more present, and the rest follows naturally. But that is not how it works. Not for people like us. Not for people who have spent years constructing an identity that runs on self-containment. The identity has to change first. This is the part nobody wants to hear. Because changing your behavior is manageable. You can change behavior through discipline, through habit, through sheer force of will. But changing your identity, the deep internal story of who you are and what you require to feel safe, that is a different kind of work entirely. It is slow. It is disorienting. And there is a period in the middle of it where you don't feel like yourself in ways that are genuinely unsettling. You've released the old story before the new one has fully formed. And in that gap, that uncomfortable, unresolved space between who you were and who you're becoming, everything feels uncertain. But here's what nobody told me. That uncertainty is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is finally actually changing. I spent years believing that emotional certainty was a prerequisite for emotional availability, that I needed to have resolved my own internal landscape before I could show up fully in someone else's, that the work had to be done first, completely, cleanly, comprehensively, before I could offer what I had left, which is a beautifully logical position. And it is, in practice, an endless deferral, because the internal landscape is never fully resolved. The work is never completely done. There is always another layer. Always another thing to understand about yourself before you feel ready to be truly known by someone else. And while you wait to be ready, life moves. People move. The ones who loved you, who had the extraordinary patience and the genuine belief to stay in your orbit, they don't wait forever. Not because they're weak, because they're human. Because love, even the most profound kind, has a threshold. And the threshold is not cruelty. It's not withdrawal. It's something far quieter and far more final. It's the moment when someone stops imagining a future with you at full presence and begins, slowly, to build a life that doesn't depend on it. Have you ever watched that happen in real time and felt completely unable to stop it? Not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't yet know how to choose differently. I have. And that specific helplessness, the helplessness of someone who can solve almost anything but cannot seem to solve the distance between themselves and the person they love most. That is one of the most clarifying experiences a driven person can have. Because it reveals, without mercy, the exact limit of what capability and intelligence can do for you. There are things that cannot be engineered. There are gaps that cannot be optimized closed. There are problems that do not respond to harder work or better strategy. They respond only to one thing, to the willingness to stop protecting yourself long enough to be genuinely, uncomfortably, irrevocably seen. That is the decision before the decision. And here's the confession I need to make, the one I've been building towards since this began. I was afraid. Not of her, not of the relationship, not of what commitment would demand in practical terms. I was afraid of the version of myself that existed inside genuine closeness. I was afraid that when someone saw me fully, not the output, not the mission, not the momentum, but the actual interior of me, with all its unresolved contradictions and quiet uncertainties, and the places where confidence gave way to something much more fragile. I was afraid that what they found there would not be enough. That underneath the velocity, underneath everything I'd built and achieved and pushed toward, there was something ordinary, something small, something that did not deserve the quality of love that was being offered. That is the fear that lives at the center of the architecture of distance, not strength. Fear. And the moment I said that out loud, not to an audience, not in a moment of performed vulnerability, but in a real and private silence, the structure began to shift. Because fear named is not the same as fear lived. When you can see it clearly, when you can say this is what this actually is, you are no longer entirely inside it. You are, for the first time, slightly outside it. Which means, for the first time, you have a choice. Think about the spacecraft again. Think about that final deceleration. Think about what the onboard system has to do to make it possible. It has to override every instinct the launch required. It has to fire in the opposite direction of its entire trajectory. It has to trust, with no immediate sensory confirmation that it's working, that slowing down will result in arrival and not in loss. That is not a small ask. That is a fundamental reversal of everything the system was built to do, and it is, without question, the most critical phase of the entire mission. The decision before the decision is exactly that. It is the internal command to stop accelerating, to trust the deceleration, to believe that what you're moving toward is worth the terrifying, unfamiliar, completely necessary act of slowing down. It asks for courage. It asks for honesty. It asks for the kind of self-knowledge that only comes when you stop running long enough to look at the ground beneath your feet. And what I found in that stillness was not the smallness I feared. What I found was the beginning of someone I actually wanted to be. Someone who had finally decided, not loudly, not dramatically, with no audience and no applause, that the distance had served its purpose, that it had protected something real, once, but that it was time, that she was worth more than the gap, that connection was not a threat to the mission. Connection was the mission. Staying is not the same as not leaving. I need you to understand that distinction before anything else I say here makes sense, because I spent a long time confusing the two. I stayed. Physically, logistically, in every measurable sense, I stayed. I was present in the way that shows up on a calendar, present in the way that could be defended in an argument. I was there. I was technically, demonstrably, consistently there. And yet the person who loved me knew, with the particular clarity that only people who pay close attention to the ones they love ever develop, that I was also, in some essential way, always slightly gone. Not absent, not cold, not unkind, just not fully landed, not fully in the room. One part of me always slightly turned toward the door, not because I wanted to leave, but because I had never actually learned how to stay. Staying, real staying, is a daily practice. It is not a decision you make once and then maintain through inertia. It is not a status. It is not a commitment you enter and then operate on autopilot, assuming the presence will take care of itself as long as you haven't physically departed. It is something you choose, actively, repeatedly, in moments so small and so ordinary that nobody would ever write about them. The moment you put the phone down without being asked. The moment you ask a question you already know the answer to, not because you need the information, but because you want to hear their voice move through it. The moment you notice they're quiet and you lean toward the quiet instead of filling it. These are not grand gestures. They are not the things that make stories, but they are the architecture of genuine presence. And they are, for someone whose instinct is always toward the next thing, the hardest discipline I have ever attempted. Because staying without disappearing requires something that runs directly counter to the psychology of high-achieving, forward-oriented people. It requires you to let the moment be enough, to not be already thinking about what comes after it, to not be managing it, assessing it, extracting its value, and moving on, to simply be inside it, fully, without agenda, without the quiet background hum of everything else competing for the bandwidth you're choosing, right now, to give to one person. One conversation. One ordinary Tuesday evening that will never be remarkable to anyone who wasn't in it. But here's what nobody told me. Those unremarkable Tuesday evenings, that is where love actually lives. Not in the grand moments. Not in the gestures that take planning and cost something visible. Not in the declarations or the milestones or the things you can look back on as evidence of having loved well. Love lives in the accumulation of ordinary presence. In the Tuesday evenings and the quiet mornings, and the moments when nothing significant is happening, and you choose, anyway, to be completely there. To be someone whose attention, which is, let's be honest, the most valuable thing any of us have to give, lands on this person, in this moment, without reservation. That is the rarest form of love. Not passion. Passion is easy for people like us. We are built for intensity. We understand the architecture of obsession better than almost anyone. But consistency, emotional consistency, the kind that shows up not when the feeling is electric and the stakes are high and the moment is cinematic, but on the days when everything is flat and routine and there is nothing compelling the presence except the choice itself. That is something else entirely. That is what most people who love hard and burn fast never actually develop. The ability to stay warm when the fire doesn't feel necessary. Have you ever been loved with that kind of consistency? Have you ever felt what it's like to be someone's daily choice, not their peak moment, not their exception, but their ordinary? And have you asked yourself honestly whether you have offered that in return? I had to ask myself that, and the answer was uncomfortable. Here's the confession I owe this moment. There were days I was present in every way except the one that mattered. I gave attention. I gave solutions. I gave the version of myself that was useful, the one with the answer, the one with the vision, the one who could see 10 steps ahead and articulate the path clearly. I gave everything that looked like love from a distance, but I withheld the one thing that cannot be replaced or substituted or compensated for with output. I withheld the part of me that was uncertain, the part that was soft, the part that didn't know the answer and wasn't moving toward one and simply needed to exist, quietly, in the company of someone who made the uncertainty feel survivable.
I withheld my incompleteness. And incompleteness shared between two people who trust each other is not weakness. It is the deepest form of intimacy available to human beings.
Think about the spacecraft one more time. Think about what happens after the deceleration, after the long burn in reverse, after the terrifying slowdown, after the moment the velocity drops below the threshold of self-sufficiency and the gravity of something larger begins to take hold. What happens next is not a collision. What happens is something that requires extraordinary, ongoing precision. It is called station keeping, the continuous, small, deliberate adjustments that maintain the relationship between two bodies in space. Not dramatic, not singular, not a moment you can point to as the achievement, just quiet, consistent, technically demanding presence. The ongoing choice to hold position, to make the micro-corrections, to not drift, not because drifting is easy, but because staying, real staying, requires its own form of active engagement. That is what emotional consistency looks like in practice. It looks like noticing when you've drifted and correcting without drama. It looks like the willingness to have the same conversation more than once, not because the other person hasn't understood, but because some things need to be said more than once to be fully believed. It looks like being the person who doesn't make them wonder, who doesn't require them to interpret your silence or read the weather of your mood from a safe distance, who makes the internal work visible enough that the other person doesn't have to guess whether they're safe. It asks for repetition. It asks for self-awareness. It asks for the daily, unglamorous, completely essential practice of choosing presence over the comfortable numbness of partial engagement. And I want to be honest about how difficult I found this. How many times I thought I was staying when I was actually just not leaving. How many times I mistook the absence of departure for the presence of arrival. Because the ego of a driven person will accept almost any evidence that it is doing enough. It will point to every metric of effort and say, look at all of this, and genuinely believe that the quantity of output constitutes the quality of presence. It does not. You can be the most impressive person in any room, and still leave the person who loves you feeling quietly, persistently, inexplicably alone. Not because you don't care, but because caring, without learning to translate it into the specific language of daily presence, into the small, warm, consistent signals that tell another person their existence matters to you beyond what they contribute to your story, caring without that translation is just a feeling. And feelings, undelivered, change nothing. Learning to stay without disappearing was the most demanding thing I have ever disciplined myself to do. Not because I lacked the desire, but because it required me to develop a completely new vocabulary, a new set of reflexes, a new answer to the question my nervous system had been asking for years, the question of what to do when something important and uncontrollable is happening inside the space between me and another person. The old answer was, manage it, contain it, return to what you can control. The new answer is harder and simpler and truer. Stay. Just stay. With full presence. With open hands. With the willingness to be moved by what moves them. With the patience to be in the room without needing to change it. With the quiet, revolutionary understanding that the person in front of you is not an interruption to the mission. They are the reason it matters. I want to tell you something that took me longer to understand than almost anything else. Closing the distance is not an event. It is not a conversation you have, a choice you announce, a moment you can frame and point to as the threshold between before and after. It is not the day you finally say the thing you've been holding. It is not the first time you let yourself be fully seen without immediately rebuilding the wall. It is not even the decision, that quiet, private, unwitnessed decision I described to stop accelerating. All of those things matter. All of them are real. But none of them, individually, is the closing of the distance. Because the distance was never really about space. It was never about geography or timing or the logistics of two lives that didn't quite align. It was about the version of yourself you were carrying into every room, every relationship, every moment of potential closeness. And closing the distance, truly, finally, in the way that changes something permanent inside you, means becoming someone who no longer needs it. That is the revelation. And I know how it sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of thing that reads beautifully and dissolves under pressure. But I mean it in the most practical, grounded, psychologically specific way I know how to mean anything. The person who maintains distance does so because at the level of identity, they believe the distance is serving them. Protecting something real, preserving something that proximity would cost. And no amount of desire, no amount of love, no amount of external motivation, not even the fear of losing someone irreplaceable, will permanently close that distance until the person genuinely, internally, stops believing the gap is necessary. Until they become, at the level of who they are rather than what they do, someone for whom closeness is not a threat. Someone for whom being known is not an exposure. Someone for whom the full gravity of another human being is not a force to counteract, but one to surrender to. With trust, with intention, with a specific kind of peace that only comes after a long and honest war with yourself. That is who I was becoming. Slowly, imperfectly. With setbacks I won't pretend didn't happen. But becoming, nonetheless. And here's what that becoming actually looked like. Not in theory, but in the texture of ordinary days. It looked like staying in the conversation past the point where I had something useful to contribute. Past the point of productivity, into the territory of simply being with another person in the full, unresolved, sometimes uncomfortable reality of what they were carrying. It looked like tolerating the silence without filling it, tolerating uncertainty without immediately converting it into a project, tolerating the feeling of need, my own need, without treating it as a problem to be solved or a weakness to be managed. It looked like saying, on days when I had nothing impressive to offer, simply, I'm here. I don't have an answer, but I'm here. And meaning it completely, without the background calculation of what that admission might cost me. Have you ever said those words without immediately qualifying them? Without the instinct to add something that would reestablish your competence, your direction, your forward momentum? Have you ever just offered your presence without the packaging? Because I want to tell you what happens when you do. Something in the other person changes, not dramatically, not like a scene from a film where music swells and everything realigns, but quietly in the way that genuine safety always manifests, quietly, like a breath finally released after being held for too long. They settle. They soften. Not because you've solved anything, not because you've said anything remarkable, but because you've done the one thing that the architecture of distance had never allowed you to do before. You've shown up without an exit strategy. You've been present without performance. You've given them not your best self, curated, polished, optimally functional, but your real self. The one that is sometimes uncertain, the one that has questions it can't answer and fears it hasn't fully resolved, the one that needs. And that self, the real, incomplete, honestly vulnerable self, is the only one capable of actual intimacy. This is what I had to learn, not abstractly, in the living of it. Through every moment I resisted the old reflex, and chose differently. Through every time the distance called to me, with its familiar comfort, its clean lines, its reliable sense of control, and I said, quietly but firmly, not anymore. Through every ordinary evening, I chose to be fully in, rather than partially present. The cumulative weight of those choices, each one small, many of them unwitnessed, those choices were the closing of the distance, not the declaration, the daily decision to be, without qualification, someone who stays. But here's the reframe I want to leave you with, the one that changed how I understood all of it. The distance I had maintained, for all the years I had maintained it, was not a flaw. I want to be clear about that. It was a response. A sophisticated, intelligent, deeply understandable response to a world that had taught a particular kind of person that self-containment was the only reliable form of safety. And that response served something real. Once, it allowed focus. It allowed momentum. It allowed the construction of things that genuinely mattered. I am not asking you to be ashamed of your distance. I am not asking you to rewrite your history as damage or your protection as failure. I am asking you to consider that you have outgrown it. That the version of you who needed the gap, who required the 3 feet, who maintained the orbit, who chose acceleration over arrival, that version did what it needed to do.